Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of injustice pressing down on your chest while the world turned its back on you? Imagine being punished not for your crimes, but for your integrity. Imagine losing everything because you chose to do what was right. This is not just a story about ancient history. This is a story about a man who stood at the crossroads of temptation and righteousness and made a choice that would cost him his freedom. His name was Joseph, and what happened to him in the house of Potiphar remains one of the most gripping and heartbreaking tales in all of Scripture. Joseph had already survived betrayal by his own brothers. He had been sold into slavery and dragged to a foreign land where he knew no one and had nothing. Yet despite all of this, he rose. He didn't just survive in Egypt, he thrived. Genesis tells us that the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything he did. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, saw this favor and placed Joseph in charge of his entire household. Everything Potiphar owned was entrusted to this young Hebrew slave. Can you imagine the level of trust that required? Can you feel the weight of that responsibility? But favor doesn't always protect you from evil. Success doesn't shield you from accusation. And integrity, as Joseph was about to discover, sometimes leads you into the darkest places before it ever leads you to the light. Because in that same household where Joseph was honored and trusted, there lived a woman whose eyes began to wander. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph. She saw his strength, his youth, his character. And in a moment that would change everything, she made her intentions clear. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat it. Genesis 39 verse 7 says she looked at Joseph with desire and said, "Come to bed with me." Pause right there. Put yourself in Joseph's sandals. He was far from home. He had no family, no protector, no advocate. This woman held power over him. One word from her could elevate him or destroy him. He was a slave in her house, and she was the master's wife. How many people in that position would have given in? How many would have rationalized it? How many would have said, "Who would even know?" But Joseph didn't. He refused her, not once but repeatedly. Day after day she pursued him, and day after day he said no. Why? Listen to his response in Genesis 39 verse 9. He said, How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Do you hear that? He didn't just think about the consequences to himself or even to Potiphar. He thought about God. His loyalty was not just to his earthly master, but to his heavenly one. This wasn't about fear of being caught. This was about reverence for the one who sees everything. Joseph understood something that many of us forget. Sin is not just about breaking rules. Sin is about breaking relationship with the God who made us. But rejection has consequences. And when a heart driven by lust is denied, it often twists into something far more dangerous. Rage, revenge, lies. One day, when no one else was in the house, Potiphar's wife grabbed Joseph by his cloak and made her demand again. And Joseph, true to his character, ran. He fled from temptation so fast that he left his cloak in her hands. That piece of fabric meant to cover him became the weapon she used to destroy him. What happened next is chilling. She called the men of her household and spun a story dripping with deception. She claimed that Joseph, the Hebrew slave her husband had brought into their home, had tried to force himself on her. She held up his cloak as evidence. She painted herself as the victim and Joseph as the predator. When Potiphar came home, she repeated the lie with even more venom. And Potiphar, whether he believed her fully or simply felt he had no choice, threw Joseph into prison. Can you feel the injustice of that moment? Can you sense the betrayal? Joseph had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had done everything right. He honored God. He honored his master. He protected his integrity at all costs. And his reward? A cold prison cell, chains around his wrists, darkness where there had been light. How do you process that kind of betrayal? How do you keep believing in a God who allows the righteous to suffer while the wicked go free? This is where the story gets uncomfortable for many of us. Because we want to believe that doing the right thing always leads to blessing. We want to think that if we just obey God and walk in integrity, everything will work out smoothly. But Joseph's story shatters that illusion. Sometimes righteousness leads to suffering. Sometimes faithfulness leads to imprisonment. Sometimes the reward for saying no to sin is being punished as if you said yes. And yet, even in that prison, something remarkable happens. Genesis 39, verse 21 tells us, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." Even in the pit, God's presence remained. Even in the darkness, divine favor flickered like a candle that refused to go out. Joseph didn't curse God. He didn't give up. He didn't become bitter. Instead, he continued to serve with excellence. The warden put him in charge of all the prisoners and everything that was done in that place. How is that even possible? How does someone maintain that kind of character after being falsely accused, wrongly imprisoned, and utterly abandoned by everyone who should have stood up for him? The answer is found not in Joseph's strength, but in his anchor. His identity was not rooted in his position or his reputation. It was rooted in his relationship with God. He knew who he was and whose he was, and that knowledge carried him through the darkest valley. While Joseph sat in that prison, two other men arrived. One was Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. The other was Pharaoh's chief baker. Both had offended the king and found themselves locked away in the same prison where Joseph now served. And one night, both of them had dreams. Strange, vivid, troubling dreams that left them confused and anxious. When Joseph saw their faces the next morning, he asked them why they looked so troubled. They explained that they had both dreamed but had no one to interpret their dreams. And here, in this moment of someone else's confusion and fear, Joseph saw an opportunity, not for himself but for service. He said something that reveals the heart of his faith. He said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Notice the humility in that statement. Joseph didn't claim to have special powers or mystical abilities. He pointed them to God. Even after everything he had endured, his faith had not wavered. Even in chains, he still believed that God was sovereign, that God was present, that God could speak through him. Can you imagine having that kind of trust after being thrown into prison for a crime you didn't commit? The cupbearer spoke first. He described his dream in detail. A vine with 3 branches budded, blossomed, and produced grapes. He took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph listened carefully and then delivered the interpretation. The 3 branches represented 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh would lift up the cupbearer's head and restore him to his former position. He would once again serve wine to the king. But Joseph didn't stop there. In a moment of vulnerability, he made a request. He said, "When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." Do you hear the pain in those words? Do you sense the longing for justice? Joseph wasn't asking for luxury or power. He was simply asking to be remembered, to be seen, to be freed from a punishment he never deserved. Then the baker, encouraged by the positive interpretation given to the cupbearer, shared his own dream. He had 3 baskets of bread stacked on his head. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating them. Joseph's face must have grown somber as he listened, because this dream carried a very different message. The 3 baskets also represented 3 days. But within 3 days, Pharaoh would lift off the baker's head and impale his body on a pole. The birds would eat his flesh. Imagine being the one to deliver that news. Imagine looking into the eyes of a man and telling him that his death was only days away. There was no sugarcoating it, no softening the blow. Joseph spoke the truth even when it was brutal. And 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, everything unfolded exactly as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored to his position. The baker was executed. The dreams were fulfilled to the letter, but here's the part that stings. The cupbearer, now back in his place of honor and influence, forgot about Joseph. Genesis 40 verse 23 says it plainly. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. 2 years would pass. 730 days. Joseph remained in that prison waiting for a word that never came, hoping for freedom that seemed to slip further away with each passing sunrise. How do you survive that kind of abandonment? How do you keep hope alive when the one person who could have helped you simply forgets you exist? This is the part of Joseph's story that doesn't get preached as often. The waiting, the silence, the crushing disappointment of being overlooked again and again. We love to talk about Joseph's rise to power. We celebrate the moment when he stands before Pharaoh and interprets the king's dreams. We, as second in command over all, admire his wisdom and his authority Egypt. But we often skip over these 2 long years of waiting in the dark. Yet those years mattered. Those years shaped him. Those years refined his character in ways that success never could. Because suffering has a way of stripping away everything that is false. It reveals what you really believe when no one is watching and no reward is in sight. Joseph could have become bitter. He could have cursed the cupbearer for forgetting him. He could have grown angry at God for allowing such prolonged injustice. But he didn't. He continued to serve. He continued to trust. He continued to believe that God had not forgotten him even when everyone else had. And isn't that the test we all face at some point? When the door doesn't open, when the promise feels delayed, when the people who should remember you move on with their lives and leave you behind. What do you do in that space? Do you lose faith? Do you grow resentful? Or do you continue to walk in integrity even when no one is applauding? Joseph chose the latter, and though he couldn't see it yet, Every single day in that prison was preparing him for a moment that would change not just his life, but the fate of an entire nation. Because God was not absent. God was not indifferent. God was orchestrating something far bigger than Joseph could have imagined. The cupbearer's forgetfulness was not a mistake. It was timing. Divine timing. Because 2 years later, Pharaoh himself would have a dream that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret, and in that moment of royal desperation, the cupbearer's memory would suddenly return. He would remember the Hebrew slave who had interpreted his dream with perfect accuracy. And Joseph, who had been forgotten by man, would be remembered by God. Joseph's story reminds us that faithfulness is not measured by immediate outcomes, but by unwavering character in the face of injustice. When you stand at your own crossroads of temptation, when you face accusations that aren't true, when you do the right thing and suffer for it anyway, remember this young man in chains who refused to let bitterness poison his soul. Remember that God's presence doesn't always mean God's rescue, but it always means God's purpose. The Lord was with Joseph in the prison just as surely as he had been with him in Potiphar's house. And though Joseph couldn't see it yet, every moment of waiting was weaving together a redemption story that would save nations. Perhaps you're in your own prison today. Perhaps you've been falsely accused, forgotten, or left behind by people who should have remembered you. If that's you, let Joseph's example speak to your heart. Your integrity matters even when no one is watching. Your faithfulness counts even when no reward appears, and your God has not forgotten you even when everyone else has. The same divine hand that lifted Joseph from the dungeon to the throne is still at work in your story. Keep believing. Keep serving. Keep trusting, because the God who sees everything is writing an ending you cannot yet imagine.